these forces that the US is now targeting were leading forces in defeating ISIS. Of course, the US is also using ISIS to an extent as a boogeyman, saying that ISIS is under your bed, that it's always... I mean, ISIS has been militarily defeated and doesn't control territory in the same way it did just 2 years ago. The thing, though, is that the US is claiming credit for destroying ISIS, when in reality, Iran, Hezbollah, the Syrian government and the Syrian army, and Russia were the leading forces that broke the back of ISIS. You're not allowed to mention that in mainstream corporate media. And what's not even less acknowledged, basically never acknowledged in mainstream corporate media, and this is a point we really need to stress, is that from day one, from the rise of ISIS, the US and its allies saw ISIS as a convenient tool and didn't necessarily, they were, let's put it this way, this is putting it mildly, they were in no rush to defeat ISIS. And there were different conflicts. Saudi Arabia and Qatar, we now know, supported ISIS along with Turkey. And I'm going to cut to an article here that I wrote back when I was actually at Salon, and this was in 2016. The article is titled, US NATO-backed Israeli think tank, Don't Destroy ISIS. It's a useful tool against Iran, Hezbollah, and Russia. And in this article, I talk about how the director of a think tank that, again, is directly supported by the US Embassy in Israel, it does contract work for NATO. So this is directly part of this imperialist war machine. The director of this think tank, who is a leading Israeli commentator who worked in the Israeli government, he said very openly, quote, "The continuing existence of the Islamic State serves a strategic purpose." He said, ISIS, quote, "can be a useful tool in undermining Iran, Hezbollah, Syria, and Russia." So, I mean, this just says everything right there. And then we have an article at the Grayzone going back several years now that looks at some of the leaked emails from Hillary Clinton that were published by WikiLeaks. And of course, WikiLeaks publisher Julian Assange is in prison being tortured right now. And this is an article I wrote back in 2016. This leaked Hillary Clinton email from 2014 cites US Western intelligence services saying that they knew that Saudi Arabia and Qatar were supporting ISIS. Of course, NATO member Turkey was supporting ISIS as well. So this gets back to the fact that the US has tried to rewrite this history of the Syrian war, which, you know, if you follow our work at the Grayzone, if you've read Max's book, The Management of Savagery, if you've listened to Rania's podcast, you might know, of course, that these Western governments and their proxies like Saudi Arabia, of Israel, of course, they all supported these Salafi jihadi so-called rebel groups inside Syria. And meanwhile, the boogeymen that we're supposed to believe are going to attack us, you know, Bill de Blasio, the fake progressive New York City mayor, went on Twitter and said that we've deployed the NYPD to strategic areas to protect us from the Iranian threat. Iran has never intentionally targeted a US civilian, especially on US territory. That is so insane. And the LAPD did the same thing. There's this intentional fear campaign as if Iran is somehow like the actual Salafi jihadi terror groups that the US's allies were supporting and Iran was fighting. So we just have to push back against this narrative that Iran is somehow like al-Qaeda and ISIS. Iran is one of the leading forces fighting al-Qaeda and ISIS. And why? It's because the majority of Iranians are Shia. And if you know anything about al-Qaeda and ISIS, anything about these Salafi jihadi groups that are influenced by the extremist Wahhabi form of Saudi regime-sponsored Islam, these are extremist Sunni Muslims. The majority of Sunni Muslims in the world are not extremists, but they are extremist Sunnis who see other forms of Islam as apostasy. And especially the people they hate the most in the entire world are Shia. And Iranians are Shia, many Syrians are Shia. So the only way that the corporate media and the US government can try to conflate these countries together and act as though al-Qaeda and Iran and all these Muslims are the same, they can only do it because of ignorance and Islamophobia. But the reality, again, to stress this point, is that Iran and the IRGC and leaders like Qassem Soleimani were the leading forces in defeating ISIS. And to quote the major Iranian scholar Mohammad Marandi, as he's been repeating again and again, were it not for generals like Soleimani and the Iranian military, the black flag of ISIS would be hanging above numerous Middle Eastern capitals right now, including potentially Baghdad in Iraq and potentially Damascus in Syria. And the US is directly responsible for the rise of ISIS.